Welcome to the Project Management Prepcast, helping you prepare for the PMP exam. Here's your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner.
Hello and welcome back to the PM Prepcast, where you can use your ears and eyes to prepare for the PMP exam. I'm your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner. In this lesson, we review and discuss the Estimate Activity Resources process. This important project time management process will help you estimate and identify the type and quantities of human resources, equipment, materials, and supplies that are required to perform each of these schedule activities and the project as a whole. We're going to be discussing the various types of resources that are estimated, several factors that influence activity resource estimating, discuss and review the process details, and we'll also review the important aspects of estimating activity resources. We begin by looking at the framework that it makes up the project time management knowledge area. The official PMBOK guide definition for project time management is that project time management includes the processes required to manage the timely completion of the project. This is accomplished by defining activities which are then sequenced, given an approximate duration and assigned resources. And a sequenced list of activities of a given time and resources, we call this a schedule. And that schedule is modified and executed over the project lifecycle. Being on time on your projects is important, so project time management gives us 7 processes to ensure that we do exactly that. We begin by planning. Schedule management. This is the process of establishing the policies, the procedures and documentation for planning, developing, managing, executing, and controlling our project schedule. Once we know how we are going to do our project time management processes, we then look at defining all activities. This is the process of identifying and documenting the specific actions to be performed to produce the project's deliverables. And once we have these activities, we're going to put them in order. We're going to sequence them in the process of identifying and documenting relationships among the project activities. At this time, we know what we have to do and in what order we have to do it. But who's going to do it and how long is it going to take them? Well, that's what our next 2 processes are all about. Estimate activity resources will tell you who is going to do it. This is the process of estimating the type and quantities of material, human resources, equipment, or supplies that are required to perform each activity. And then estimate activity durations will tell you how long. This is the process of estimating the number of work periods needed to complete individual activities with estimated resources. At this point in time, we have everything ready to develop our schedule. We know what activities we're going to do, in which order we're going to do them, who's going to do them, and how long it's going to take them. So we can focus on the process of analyzing activity sequences, durations, resource requirements, and schedule constraints to create the project schedule model. And last but not least, I said it's important to stay on time, to deliver your project on time. You want to control your schedule. This is the process of monitoring the status of project activities to update project progress and manage changes to the schedule baseline to achieve your plan. Project time management is practically all about planning how you're going to execute your project, in what order you're going to do your activities, how long they're going to take, etc. So estimate activity resources is no different than the first 3 processes we've already looked at. It's in the planning process group, and it's no different than the next 2 we're going to be looking at. They're also in the planning process group. Only control schedule there at the very end is different. That's a monitoring and controlling process. The main concept and central theme in estimate activity resources is that the accurate estimation of duration and costs require a thorough understanding of the resources that are required for individual activities and the project as a whole. Not understanding your resources, their skills, who they are, what they are, can lead to cost overruns, schedule slippage, and possibly project failure. So the estimate activity resources process helps us identify and quantify the resources required for each activity. For any given activity on your project, we may require some or all of these type of resources here: people, equipment, material, goods, or supplies. So even though we will focus mainly on the topic of estimating what type of human resources are needed to perform our activities, we should never forget that our activities need some or all of these types. And when estimating resources, you should consider the following 4 factors: the complexity of the task, the skill level that is required of the resource performing the task, the organization's history in doing similar activities, and finally, the required resources availability. If you properly weigh these factors, you should be able to provide accurate estimates for the resources required. When choosing resources, it's imperative that adequate consideration is given to what resource is best to do a particular job. Let's say one of the activities on your project requires a hole to be dug that is 40 centimeters by 40 centimeters wide and another 40 centimeters deep. How long this will take to dig that hole is dependent on your choice of resources. Suppose we have many of these holes to dig. We better choose our resource wisely, or it could take a long time. So, using a 6-year-old child would result in the activity being completed in about 1 to 2 hours with a little spatula that the kids are using there. Probably not the ideal, because since many holes would require a lot of time needs to be scheduled for this 6-year-old to dig the hole, notwithstanding that child labor is usually frowned upon. A better choice would be an adult who could probably complete each hole in about 10 to 20 minutes. But if we had still many holes to dig, even this choice may not be optimal. A modern excavating machine, on the other hand, would complete the task in about 10 seconds or so? And if you had hundreds of these holes to dig, it would likely be the best choice of resources. In addition to considering duration when choosing resources, it's also very important to look at these resources from a cost perspective. After all, each resource has a cost associated with them, an hourly rate maybe, and selecting one type of resource over another can have an impact on your project cost. But there's more to cost than just simply the hourly rate. Know-how and experience are also connected to cost. If your resources don't have the appropriate know-how to perform a task, you must send them to be trained, and that costs money. Or you could decide that it's overall cheaper for you to hire external resources with this particular specialized know-how. Remember that the more experience a resource has, the resource will usually cost more. Account for this. As you can see in this overview here of the inputs, tools, techniques, and outputs from the PMBOK guide, we have a ton of inputs, we have 5 tools and techniques, and we have 3 outputs. Now, this process here is mostly about how to do things. So the tools and techniques are important, the outputs are important, so we're only going to be doing the most briefest of review of our inputs. And we can do just this briefest of review of our inputs because we have seen all of these previously. The schedule management plan is required. It defines and describes the level of accuracy and units of measure for our project resources. The activity list is required. It provides a list of all activities that will require resources. And without knowing what you have to do, you can't say who's going to do it. The activity attributes provide detail for activities that allow resource estimation for those activities. Then we have resource calendars. These can be consulted to identify what resources, such as human resources or equipment, are available at a given time. The risk register will provide a list of risk events that may impact resources required, selected, or available. Activity cost estimates, they can influence whether or not resources are used, and if so, what type of resources are used based on their cost. Enterprise environmental factors such as resource availability, location, and skills can influence our resource selection. And then the organizational process asset at the end, they can influence or impact resource use. Most common example are policies and procedures that address staffing, the rental or purchase of material, equipment, and supplies. So we have all of these inputs, and what are we going to do with them? Well, we're going to apply our tools and techniques to them. There are 5 of them. We have expert judgment, alternatives analysis, published estimating data, bottom-up estimating, and finally, project management software. Each of these tools and techniques will help you to estimate all the resources that you are going to need on your individual activities. Expert judgment is our first tool and technique, and here are a few things that experts can provide when it comes to estimating resources for our activities. First off, experts can help the project staff choose the right resources based on their wealth of experience with similar projects or activities. Once we have decided on which resource is correct for the task, experts can help us determine how many of these resources we should employ for a given activity. Experts earn their big paychecks also by sharing their knowledge of the requirements of a given activity that is common in their area of expertise. And lastly, a benefit to using experts is that they often possess specialized knowledge in many approaches to resource estimation and typically provide a choice of resources appropriate for a given activity. Let's delve into this last benefit of using experts, alternative analysis. Just as we have choices of how we create energy, we have choices of what resources to assign to the various project tasks. As project managers, our project team and often experts will assist us in identifying several resource options for our activities. When choosing resources, we must first determine what is the best choice and why. Is faster always the best choice? What about reliability or quality? The analysis of alternatives should consider all the ways to accomplish the activity. Should the task be done manually, or is automation a better choice? Questions such as whether it makes sense to do the work in-house or use external resources need to be considered when estimating resources. Very often, project managers will have to consider whether it makes more sense to build or buy, for example, software. Should we build it ourselves or purchase this software from a vendor? Both the requirements of an activity or its product as well as the current environment will limit our choice of alternatives. One example that immediately comes to mind are resource shortages and their effect on cost and consideration of alternatives. So, as you see, there are many considerations when choosing and estimating the resources required for the project activities, and it's good to have alternatives. It's also very important for us to keep in mind that the choice of resource or quantity that we need can potentially impact multiple project variables like time and cost. But how do we make these decisions without having an enormous base of knowledge about those factors and more? Well, the answer can be published estimating data. This data is indeed available, and it tells us how long it will take an excavator to dig a hole, how long it takes a skilled laborer to dig the same hole, and maybe not, how long it takes a 6-year-old girl to do the same job. Similarly, there are catalogs available that give you the unit cost for labor, equipment, and material resources. Having these two pieces of information available, you can use the rate information and the unit cost together together to determine the total cost of production for the resources selected. Next, let's take a look at project management software. This is definitely something you are going to want to use. The latest generation of software will allow you to consider several factors when estimating resources, such as resource breakdown structures, resource calendars, rates, and costs. And having all of these in one package will allow you to determine scheduling conflicts, take resource availabilities into account, and at the push of a button, create instant schedule alternatives for comparison. And that is how project management software will support us in our endeavor of estimating activity resources. And the same thing goes for the technique of bottom-up estimating. For example, let me ask you this. How many and what type of resources do you need to build a communication satellite and launch it into space? What would you say? Well, it doesn't really matter what your answer was or would have been, or even if you had an answer, but I can probably guess what instantly started happening in your mind there. In order for you to even begin to estimate the resources, you probably began breaking this enormous task down into smaller, more manageable tasks. And once they were small enough, you'd then be able to estimate the required resources for each schedule activity. Then you would assign people, equipment, material, and supplies to it, and then you can take all these estimates and add the numbers up. That's bottom-up estimating. We are moving on to the three outputs of estimate activity resources, and here they are. We have the activity resource requirements, the resource breakdown structure, also known as the RBS, and also project document updates. Let's discuss these outputs a little bit more in detail. The goal of this process is to identify and estimate what kind of and how many resources are needed for each activity in a work package. So the activity resource requirement list contains the quantity and type of resources for each activity. It can be used to aggregate the total resources required in a work package or a work period. Often it will contain a basis of the estimates for each resource, and it contains the assumptions that were used to determine the resource estimates. Well, and another thing we can do with our list of resources which we have identified is to present them in the form of a resource breakdown structure like you see here. This resource breakdown structure is our second output, and it is a great way of presenting the list of our required resources in a graphical format. On this example, we have chosen to show only the human resources that are needed by category. Of course, you could have other categories like labor, material, equipment, supplies, and so on. And take a look at the welding category. Here you see an example that includes the skill level of our resources, because we have master welders as one category and also apprentice welders as a second. Our third output are the project document updates, and two of the project documents that may have to be updated as an output of the estimate activity resources process are the activity list and the activity attributes. The activity list is the comprehensive list of all the activities that are required to produce our deliverables, and maybe by assigning resources we figured out, well, something is missing, there are typos, things are too much, we have to change things around. Well, we may have to update the activity list. And of course, if we update the activity list, most often we will also update the activity attributes. These describe the various characteristics and requirements of our schedule activities. And again, by figuring out what resources will be working on our activities, we may see the need for changing some activity attributes. Another project document that may need updating as an output of this process are the resource calendars. As you are estimating your activity resources, you will notice that there may be scheduling conflicts where someone or some equipment may be otherwise tied up and therefore not available to the project. You will need to update your project calendar and your resource-specific calendars to document this. This should be done for all types of resources, whether they're human, materials, equipment, and supplies. Let's review. Why do we estimate activity resources? We do it because we want to estimate how many and what type of resources we will need on our project. But how exactly do we accomplish this? Well, we take our activities and our resources, and we apply expert judgment and alternatives analysis in order to identify and define the resources that are needed for each activity. Often we document this as activity resource requirements in the activity list and activity attributes. And now that we have this list, you can also create a resource breakdown structure, an RBS. Now, the good news here is that now that we know all of this, now that we know the type and quantity of resources that we need for each schedule activity, we can go ahead and we can now accurately estimate the activity duration. But estimate activity duration, that is the next process here in project time management. But this here now concludes our review of estimate activity resources. But before we go, here is a quick exam tip for you. Consider working together with a study partner. I bet there is someone living in your area who's also studying for the PMP exam. A good way to prepare together is to set 2 hours away every weekend to meet. You can ask each other sample questions from your books and discuss the answers. Discussing these questions together with a colleague helps you greatly in understanding the reasoning behind them. And if you can't find another project manager to work with you, why don't you ask your husband, wife, brother, sister, or work colleague to help you with this? They may be willing to help you with these questions, and then explaining the reasoning behind the answer to a non-project manager is going to teach you a lot, because you're going to have to explain to them what the reasoning is. And we have now reached the end of this PM Prepcast lesson. So it's time for Justine to say,
I will miss you.
Until next time.